We are on lecture 6 of Econ 172, and we are well into geography, health, and development. So we're making good progress on this part of the course. I just posted problem set 1. If you have your computer open, please don't look at it in the middle of lecture, but maybe after lecture would be a good time. And it's due next Thursday at 3:30, so just before lecture next Thursday. So you basically have a week to work on it. And I know that the GSIs will be discussing it and whatnot. And speaking of GSIs, maybe Pierre can mention about the extra section today. So maybe let me write that on the board. Okay. Oh, are you okay? Okay, any questions or comments before we get started? All right, so let's just dive right into a clicker question. I'm just curious. They've been webcasting, I think, the lectures, and I just wanted to check in, and this is really just informational from my part. So far, have you watched any of the webcast lectures? A, not yet, and I probably won't. Just be honest, I'm just curious. Not yet, probably will, one time, a few times, many times. So maybe you guys can, I have to start the poll. So maybe you guys can just record answers to that, and I can get a sense of what those look like. Just be honest, okay. What's that? I don't know, I'm trying to figure that out. I just want to figure out how much interest there is in it, and just wait another few seconds for people that haven't clicked in yet. Okay, so this is useful information. So most people think they will. A few people already have. Maybe 13% of folks have already watched one of the videos. Maybe another 2/3 say they will. So that's really good. I think what I found in the past is maybe before midterms or exams, folks review the material. So okay, I'm glad to see that there is interest in this, at least among most of the class. Excellent. Okay, so why don't we just get started? We wrapped up last time discussing this question about how we should interpret a correlation between tropical disease and low income, and talked about these two very different approaches, or two very different research papers arguing that certain channels were important. You know, there was this issue of Bloom and Sachs emphasizing current disease burden affecting, say, current labor productivity today, and Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson piece saying, well, you know, tropical disease matters, but it matters because it affected the whole trajectory of European settlement and colonization in these countries. And as we got to a bit at the end last time, this is a pretty heated debate, and there's been a lot of back and forth about the reliability of the data. You know, part of the reason why there's a lot of debate on the reliability of the Acemoglu, Johnson, Robinson data is their data is based on the mortality of European colonizers hundreds of years ago in many different countries. So there was some expedition, some military expedition, or there was some group of traders and merchants that went to a certain part of the world, and there's some record of how many of them may have died of malaria on that trip, but they're from scattered sources, no one knows how reliable those records are, and they're from centuries ago. So the data is sort of inherently not as good as we would like. So that's part of the reason for the debate. The alternative approach is to study these issues using very detailed, what we call micro data. Data, say, from today on individuals, on firms, on schools, on communities, where we can measure things very rigorously today and try to make stronger claims and really get better evidence about the link between these different variables. And this is basically what you're going to be doing on problem set 1, which is really just meant to introduce you to, you know, the basics of looking at this data, plotting out the data, running some basic regressions, and, you know, really getting you familiar with and comfortable with microdata. So you'll see that when you look at problem set 1. The other thing that we have going for us when we look at current data, especially using the techniques that we're going to focus on this course, is we have what are called better research designs. So by research design, basically saying we're able to take advantage of data that has a certain structure. Sometimes that data is structured by an actual experiment. In other words, there was some sort of randomization process, some other sort of experimental process that effectively creates treatment and control groups in a way I'll talk about today. Sometimes there was no actual experiment done by researchers, but the structure of a policy change or some other change creates what we call a natural experiment. So in either case, whether it's a deliberate experiment or a natural experiment, we're actually much better off than folks using data from hundreds of years ago where we really are unlikely to find that kind of experimental variation. Okay, so let's get to this particular issue of you know, linking health to income. One channel that you guys mentioned a little bit in the discussion last time, but you know, doesn't feature quite as much in Acemoglu, Johnson, Robinson, or Bloom and Sachs, is the channel of education. So the red line here is sort of the Bloom and Sachs story. If you're unhealthy, you have lower income, let's say because you're less productive today. There may just be this direct, immediate, contemporaneous effect of poor health on income. You know, if you're sick, you can't work. But there's a lot of other channels, as we've learned, and one other very plausible channel that could link poor health to income is education. So stepping back from contemporaneous poor health, think about the consequences of poor health in childhood. If kids are sick when they're growing up, and because of that, they get less schooling, there could be a sort of lifetime set of consequences for their labor market performance. They don't have the skills they would have had if they were healthy. Maybe they dropped out of school because they were sick. Maybe they didn't perform well on an exam because they were sick, so they couldn't get into secondary school, or they couldn't get into university in systems where there are limited slots at those levels of education. For all those reasons, poor health can have these very long-lasting consequences. So even if, let's say we look at adults and we find, you know, sick adults, you know, when they're in their 20s, 30s, 40s, yeah, they're a little less productive, but not that much less productive. That doesn't necessarily disprove that poor health is a big deal. So, you know, one way Acemoglu, Johnson, Robinson could strike back at Bloom and Sachs is say, we got data from, you know, workers in an African setting, and sick workers are 10% or 5% less productive than healthy workers. Well, those 5 or 10% differences can't explain the sort of income differences we see across country. Remember, multiples of 20, multiples of 30? But maybe once we start bringing in other mechanisms like education, we start getting a little closer to explaining those gaps. Okay, so again, there are potentially long-run effects if illness in childhood shapes your whole educational path in life. A particular disease that we're going to talk about, and this is one that I've worked on, it's one of the readings on the course, are a tropical disease, a tropical infectious disease, which are intestinal worms or intestinal helminths. These are really yucky diseases. They're spread through fecal matter, so through There's other words for that. You know what I'm getting at here. Spread through fecal matter, and basically spread through poor hygiene and sanitation. So when someone has intestinal worms in their intestines, when they defecate, the worm eggs are basically in their fecal matter, and that gets passed on to other people. So they're really diseases of poor hygiene, poor sanitation, and they're very prevalent around the world. So these are some figures from maybe 10 years ago, where there are literally billions of people infected with these worms: hookworm, roundworm, whipworm. Schistosomiasis has fewer, but actually a lot of those are in Africa, including in East Africa, where we will look at them. And just one point, you can't add up these numbers to get the total number of people with worm infections, because many people have multiple infections. You can have hookworm, roundworm, whipworm, and schistosomiasis, or you can have 3 of them or 2 of them. So, but the best guess is somewhere like a quarter of the world's population has at least one of these worms. So they're very widespread, and they have a range of health and nutritional consequences. So these worms, once you get them, once you make contact with this infected fecal matter, and you either ingest those worm eggs, or for some of the worms, even if they just come into contact with your skin, the worm eggs go through your body and then end up in your intestines, and they're little worms. They basically bite onto the sides of your intestines. It's so disgusting. And there was like one guy having a snapback there. He was like, I don't know. I made that up. He's not really good. So biting into your intestines, and that has nutritional consequences. Why? The worms eat some of your food. The worms, when they bite into your intestines, make you bleed somewhat, so they can lead to anemia. They also, because they're basically this widespread infection, some people have hundreds of these worms in their intestines, lead to a range of immunological responses in the body. So when your body is basically fighting off infection, certain things happen. Your intestines become inflamed. There's a stress response or a cortisol response. There's a whole range of immunological responses that can also affect the absorption of nutrients, and that can affect your broader health status. So for instance, if your immune system is really busy fighting off all these worm infections you have, you may be more prone to other infections. In fact, there's a range of health evidence now that people with lots of worm infections may be more susceptible to malaria, for instance, which is a really big deal in this part of the world. So worm infections have this range of nutritional consequences directly and broader immunological consequences as well. The nutritional consequences are anemia, weakness, listlessness, meaning folks are tired, as well as some stunting of growth. And one of the things that characterizes these infections is it isn't like a 0-1, you're infected or you're not infected. Different people just have different numbers of worms in their intestines, and the more you have, the more of a worm load you have, the sicker you are, because you just have more of these parasites basically inside you. So this is the map of the extent of worm infections, again from about a decade ago, but the broad patterns are similar. You see tons of worm infections in sub-Saharan Africa. There's lots of African countries, over at least 20, 30, 40% of the population with worm infections there. You can see in Kenya somewhere between maybe a quarter and a half of the population, and we're going to be studying in Kenya. In parts of Latin America, there are low rates of worm infections. What's kind of neat about this map is they actually have the data broken down by states in India and China, which is nice just because a state in India or China can have 100 million people and has its own geography and history. So you can see there's some regions, especially the 2 regions in India that are darker are I think that's Uttar Pradesh. Oh no, it's probably Uttar Pradesh, and that's Nepal. That's actually not part of India. The second darker one, I think Bangladesh has a lot. And then you see some of the non-coastal parts of China also have high worm infections. So there's a lot of worm infections in Asia, tons in Latin America. One thing that's interesting is historically there were worm infections in the U.S. So in the U.S. South, in the early part of the 20th century, there were tons of worm infections. So the estimate is in 1910, in the southern states, 40% of the population had hookworm, which is one of the most prevalent worms globally. And in fact, the first major project carried out by the Rockefeller Foundation, a very large philanthropic nonprofit, was to deworm the U.S. South. So they went over, I think 12 states or 14 states and carried out medical treatment. They tried to improve hygiene and sanitation, all the kinds of things deworming programs do today in poor countries they did in the U.S. South, from 40%, from levels that are pretty typical of many poor countries today. So this is a problem that basically 100 years ago was a really big deal, even in parts of the U.S. We're going to be focusing on Kenya. So let me tell you a little bit more about these infections. What I want to do now is sort of set the stage for this health problem, and then we're going to talk about the econometrics of understanding it. So this is going to be a little bit of a half public health lecture, half econometrics lecture today. So I already mentioned how the worms are transmitted, really through poor hygiene and sanitation. Basically, if people don't wash their hands adequately after coming into contact with fecal matter, they can touch others and infect them. If they don't use a latrine when they defecate, their fecal matter is in the environment. And yes, please. Yeah, yes. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if you were here at the last lecture too, but we had a large discussion about a range of tropical diseases, malaria and others, and I'll certainly be coming back to that. But for now, maybe I'll stick to this. But certainly the lecture last time, we discussed a range of those very important tropical diseases and the whole debate about the role they're playing in African underdevelopment. So that's kind of where we're at. We're honing in now on one particular tropical disease. We're going to try to understand it well to give us some insight into the broader problem. Yeah. I don't understand the question. Can you explain? I don't know. I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean about the mutation. I mean, every organism, I guess, mutates. But what do you mean by temporal? You're saying I'm talking about disease as temporal. What do you mean by that? I'm trying to clarify your point. Yes. Well, they've been in Africa. They've been all over the world forever. So, the best guess of the epidemiologists that study worms is that humans have always had lots of worms. If you look at our close ancestors, if you look at monkeys, primates, they have almost the exact same worms we do. So probably for millions of years, our ancestors had worms, and worms were a natural part of their biology. There are lots of other mammals that have worms. So it isn't like they came from the south and were transferred to Africa at all. They've been everywhere, and it's just a question of sort of limiting through good hygiene and sanitation, sort of limiting their prevalence. I'm really aware of them, and I spent the last lecture discussing them, so I'm just a little confused. As I said, we've been discussing it last time. Yeah. Yes. There are worm infections all over Asia, Latin America, and certainly the way the worms got to all the world is when people migrated through human history. They had worms in their intestines, so the worms sort of went with them, for sure. Okay. So let me continue. So the transmission, as I mentioned, is through poor hygiene and sanitation. And the really interesting thing about worm treatments from our perspective here is that treating one person in the context of an infectious disease has a social dimension. It has a dimension that goes beyond that person. If you treat the worm infections in my body, then there's no longer worm eggs in my fecal matter, or there's no longer worm eggs in your fecal matter. If I treat myself, it actually benefits other people in my community because they're not going to be coming into contact with the worm eggs. So basically, taking these deworming drugs that we'll talk about clears people's intestines of infection and means that their fecal matter won't have as many eggs. We're going to come back to this a lot. This is what economists call an externality. The idea is your action affects other people. And this is a case of a positive externality. When I do something good for my health, it benefits other people's health in my community. It's a spillover, an external benefit. But if I'm not seeing the direct benefit of that treatment, then I may underinvest in my treatment. So it's a case where there might be a rationale for subsidies, and I'm going to come back to that pretty soon. So the other thing to keep in mind about worm infections is these aren't like viruses that reproduce in the body. So that kind of model of, very often when people think of a new disease, they think of vaccination and then virus model. That's sort of the model they have in mind. It's not like this at all. There's no vaccine for worms. If you basically get infected, these worms move into your intestine. Yeah, go ahead. So in the South, they had drugs. There were mass drug programs, and there's certain drugs that basically kill the worms in your intestines. The drugs today are a lot better, so they don't have as bad side effects as they did then. The other way you can do it, there's a bunch of things, and we'll come to some of the details. If you can improve people's hygiene enough, then they're not going to basically be defecating in the environment. So if you build bathrooms and toilets and latrines and get people to use them, then that'll have benefits for everybody else. So those are kind of like two different ways to go. Yeah, I'm going to talk all about how we treat it today, but the techniques in some ways are kind of similar. We're still trying to improve hygiene and sanitation. We're still distributing drugs. And the Rockefeller Foundation is interesting. They didn't only do it in the US South. They started doing these deworming programs in Latin America. They had kind of global reach. But the region where they didn't do as much and there wasn't as much success was in sub-Saharan Africa. And so that's, it's also a very poor region where the kind of public health needs are greater. Any other comments or questions? Yeah. When the South got dewormed, yeah. Big decrease in the US GDP. How does that relate to African? This relates to slow GDP growth of all the African. That's a great question. So let me actually write this name on the board. There's a researcher at University of Chicago whose name is Hoyt Blakely. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of his stuff. But he has a paper on exactly your question. So he basically got data on where the Rockefeller Foundation targeted their programs in the US South, and they targeted certain areas and not others. And then he went to US Census data 30 years later to look at incomes in those exact counties relative to the counties that weren't targeted. And he finds a gain. He says in the areas where people were targeted with deworming, there's an average gain in income of about 20% 30 years later. So like a really large impact of these programs on income. So his claim is, and of course there were a lot of other health problems in the South and a lot of other things changed at the same time, but his argument is when we look at this great narrowing of income differences between the North and the South that you see in the 20th century, because the South today is much closer to the North in income than it was 100 years ago, at least a piece of it might be due to all these health programs. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, so this is a really big issue because in those African cases where we saw 50, 80, whatever % of the population is infected, it's very difficult to literally eliminate infection. The current recommendation of the World Health Organization is not really to go for eradication so much as to control the disease. So to do regular rounds of treatment to kind of keep trying to push the infection levels down, knowing that it's going to be very hard to literally get the extinction or the elimination of that infection. So again, it's very different than what we think of as a vaccine model. With the vaccine model, we kind of feel like once we can vaccinate the whole population, then we're pretty safe. There might be little outbreaks, or maybe little pockets of people who are not vaccinated, but with worms, it doesn't work that way. What you need is sort of regular treatment what they recommend is typically every 6 months to a year to keep the worm loads down in the population. So it's a sort of different model. It's more of a control model rather than an elimination model that they propose. Okay, so an interesting thing about the worms, again, every worm you have in your body is due to contact with one of these worm eggs. So you either ingest a worm egg, comes into contact with your skin, gets into your intestine, and the worms typically live for about 1 to 2 years. They don't live forever, and they don't reproduce in the body. So this is actually encouraging. The encouraging thing is, if only you could reduce people's exposure to the worm infections, to the worm eggs, for a couple years, they basically won't have any worm infections left in their intestines. The worms are just going to die out. So that's why these control programs are seen as so important. If only you can kind of reduce reinfection. So I treat everybody here. There's still some worms, but by treating everybody else, you're reducing the reinfection of others. And over the course of a year or two, they're just not going to have any worms left in their body, so they're going to be healthier. And what's very important about that, and this gets back to the externality, is even those who didn't get the drugs themselves, for whatever reason, they missed the treatment day, or they weren't eligible for some reason, over the course of a year or two, if they're not getting reinfected, they're not going to have many worms either, even if they didn't get the drugs themselves. So that's the sort of externality benefit of treatment. Okay, so the good news about that kind of treatment is it's very cheap. Treating twice a year with generic drugs at large scale is less than $1 per year. I think the current estimates are more like 40 cents per year in Africa. And part of the reason that they're able to achieve such incredible cost effectiveness is by distributing the drugs through schools. So that's actually the World Health Organization recommendation is to say, you have a school of 300 or 400 kids. You basically train one teacher in that school to administer the pills. It's very easy to administer. You just say, here's the pill. And they take some water, and you do that twice a year. You basically send a big box to that school, and you either train a teacher in that school or send one public health nurse to that school, and you can basically deworm the school at very low cost. And that's the model that's recommended. Now, in a small, and these are the names of the drugs, albendazole or mebendazole, there's 2 variants, are the drugs that are used to treat what are called the geohelminths, hookworm, roundworm, and whipworm. Praziquantel is used to treat schistosomiasis, which is a slightly different organism, but these diseases are sort of grouped together, and the mass treatment usually occurs with both pills in places where both are present. Yeah. Per kid, per child, yeah. It's estimated to be about 40 cents per child per year right now, just because they're really cheap generics. You can get a big box of them, ship it to a school, and so it's estimated to be really, really cheap. In the back. Yeah, yeah. I'll talk about sort of in detail the Kenyan National Deworming Program and other efforts that I'm aware of. And the typical way these programs are done is that there is a formal training process of teachers in the districts, and there's definitely a lot of information meetings with parents. And even with the program that we do,